Welcome to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility, an ongoing inquiry into American political origins and evolving institutions. The Executive Director of the Virtual Center is Dr. Bill Obrien. He's also your host for this continuing conversation. Here he is now, Dr. Bill Obrien.
Thank you, Bob Kincaid, and welcome to the Virtual Center for Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility. On this day in late August, today is the 26th day of August in the year 2019. We are live. I was trying to think of something creative to say coming on the program today because it's been 3 weeks since we've had a program. And all I could think of was Jack Nicholson in The Shining saying, "I'm back." But seriously, I am. And I had a wonderful, wonderful time with family, a lot of traveling, going to New England and back, and had time to spend with family, brothers and sister, and a cousin that I hadn't seen since we were 6 years old. She's 1 month younger than I, and I hadn't seen her since we were 6. And we had lunch with her, and it was delightful. And so all in all, it was a wonderful 2 weeks or a couple of weeks for me. If there's one gap in it or one problem with it, it was the fact that we weren't doing the program. And I was telling Bob before we came on the air, we were chatting, that yesterday, Sunday, as I was thinking about a program today, I became very nervous because it's been so long since I've done one. And not only that, but during the period of the 3 weeks, for all practical purposes, I was out of pocket as far as the news is concerned. And it was kind of nice, to be very honest with you, because as I think I had said more than once on this program, before the 3 week break that I took, President Trump was making me tired. And I really didn't realize how true that was until for 10 days we had grandchildren, which meant that we were both my wife and I were pretty busy with 3 grandchildren. The oldest one, 12. And that meant that that I couldn't spend as much time surveying the different newspapers around the country and websites and various other things. And without the program as an incentive, it became less and less something I wanted to do anyway. And so for all practical purposes, I really became, ended up being what, for lack of a better term, you might call out of pocket. And so when I came back and I made contact with Bob and Agnes, it was last Tuesday, and I kind of begged off a program for Wednesday because I really didn't know after 3 weeks whether, in fact, I could put a program together in a day or not. At least I didn't feel comfortable that I could. So therefore, I had 3 or 4 days, the end of this past week and through this last weekend, to kind of get my head back in gear, as it were, to do programs. And as the start time for today's program neared late this morning, I became more and more excited about doing a program. Fact of the matter is, there's so much to talk about that it becomes difficult, from my perspective, to plan a program because there's so many different options, so many different directions you could go. Like everyone else, I thought this weekend, with President Trump overseas at the G7, or as many people refer to it, the G6+1, or the G7-1, however you want to consider it, I like everybody else was picking up the ups and downs, positives and negatives of what was going on at the G7. I have some conclusions. I've drawn some conclusions about that. In fact, I drew some conclusions over the last week about the behavior of the president. Like everyone else, I watched the stock market tank 600 points, almost 600 points. It actually was up closer to 7 at one point on Friday because of the things the president was saying about the tariff war with China. And that has taken a number of different turns over the weekend and into this morning as well. So there are a number of issues that I would like to address. And one in particular that's very pertinent to me, which I'll explain after we do the intro to the program. And I try to remember the ways that you can communicate with the program and participate in it by either coming on the air or communicating with me via email or through our Facebook page. So let me do that first. And then I will get back and share a few things about today's program. And I'll give you kind of the context of what I think a significant portion of today's program will be based on. As I mentioned, we have a way, an opportunity for you listeners to this program to come on the air and share your thoughts with not only with me, but with our other listeners as well. We realize, and I think I've mentioned more than a few times on this program, we've come to realize that the bulk of our audience listens to the program not live, but the recorded version. And what that has effectively done is minimize the number of listeners who call. I realize that. I think Bob and Agnes realize it as well. But on the other hand, we do have callers, and I think Horst from Taiwan is the one that comes to mind. I also want to reestablish contact with Kevin Shanley because I think it's beyond time for an update from Kevin on the issues of China and Taiwan, Hong Kong, and all the rest of it. There's a lot going on in Hong Kong. There's a lot going on between China and Hong Kong. There's a lot going on between China and the United States. And so I can't think of a better way to kind of bring all of us up to speed on that than to ask Kevin Shanley to come on with us and do that. That I will be doing maybe later today after the program. I don't know if it'll be this week or not, but Kevin did indicate while I was gone that he would love to do another program, and he was especially interested in what's going on with Hong Kong. Kevin now is submitting pieces, he told me, to the New York Times. Kevin's expertise in the Far East is gaining some notoriety. And I think it's a tremendous opportunity for us to have access to him for what usually becomes close to the full 2 hours of his time. It's informative. It's wonderful. It's something that I've missed and something I look forward to resuming. We do have an 800 number that gives you an opportunity to call directly into the Head On Radio Network studios. Bob is there today, and he will get you on the air immediately if you call. The number, toll free, is 844-THE-HORN. That translates into 844-843-4676. 843-4676 on your keypad translates into the horn. So it's much easier to remember 844, the horn. That'll get you on the air immediately, and I do invite you to take advantage of that opportunity. If you'd like to communicate with me on issues related to the program, some of the issues we've been covering, issues that we are likely to be covering, then you can do so in two ways. You can either direct an email to me, or you can communicate directly with me via our Facebook page. If you would like to send me an email, my email address is waobrien906@gmail.com. Again, waobrien, BRIEN 906@gmail.com. If you prefer to send your comment to me via Facebook, you can do that by going to our Facebook page. And the way you do that is to go to Facebook, facebook.com, and in the search box at the top of the homepage, type in the Virtual Center for Study of the Constitution, and that'll immediately take you to our Facebook page. And you'll notice on that Facebook page that there are a number of postings that I've put on there regularly since we've been doing this program. In fact, I put one on there just prior to the start of this weekend, I think toward the end of last week. And I'll be getting to that maybe tomorrow, another day this week, because I do think the issue addressed in that particular posting is a significant one. But I didn't want to get into that in the first program, my first program back. The point is that after each posting, there are two computer links. If you click on the link that is labeled share, it sends that particular posting to all the friends in your on your Facebook account. And of course, that would create much wider audience for us. And for that, I would thank you. If you click on the comment link, it gives you an opportunity to send a comment directly to me, very similar to an email. My Facebook account will immediately notify me that there has been a comment made to one of the postings on our Facebook page. And then Facebook will take me directly to the posting and your comment. The implication, of course, is that your comment would be related to that particular posting. But that's not necessarily a requirement. The minute you get access to the comment link, that gives you an opportunity to make a comment directly to me about the program. It can be about that posting, of course, but it doesn't have to be. The point is, I'll read it immediately, and it'll give me an opportunity to respond appropriately to you. And that's really what this is all about, is the back and forth, the interaction between us all. The point is, I do want to encourage as much intercommunication as possible, even though I recognize that because of the time of day that we're doing our programs, 1 to 3 during the week, that's a premium time for other programs. And that's when, for example, that's when Tom Harmon is on, for example. It's also a time when people work. It's right in the middle of the workday. And so the consequence of all of these different things is that I know that live listeners out there aren't that plentiful. There are some, because I get emails occasionally from them letting me know that they're out there. But the reality is that more often than not, the comments I get are from listeners speak to the fact that they are getting the programs recorded because they are unable to listen live because of jobs or other responsibilities that they have. And I appreciate that, and I understand that. So with that, then let me welcome you to the program. Let me let you know how glad I am to be here doing a program. And I'd like to touch upon a few things before we get into the meat of today's program. I think the meat of today's program. I'd like to basically tell you what I think that meat will be. I haven't been totally idle during the time since we last did a live program. I've been contacted to deliver a series of lectures on the Constitution of the United States beginning in September. The first one scheduled for the 17th of September, which just happens to be Constitution Day. That's the day that the Constitutional Convention adjourned in 1787. And many of you will recall that some years ago, West Virginia Senator Robert C. Byrd was successful in getting through Congress legislation mandating that from that time forward, September 17th of each year would be officially known as Constitution Day. And every institution that was the recipient of public money, tax money from the federal government, would be required in honor of Constitution Day each year to present a program of some sort to honor the legacy of the Constitution and those who framed it. A few years after I retired from Concord University, as many of you will know, in 2013. I believe it was about 2015 or 16, 2 or 3 years after I retired, that I was contacted by Concord, by the folks at the very institution that I had retired from, asking me to come back and deliver a lecture in honor of Constitution Day on September 17th of that particular year. I think it was 2016, maybe. I don't know that it was any more recently. That's about 2 or 3 years ago anyway. Just early this summer, I was contacted by the local historical society here in southern West Virginia, asking me if I would be interested in presenting a series of lectures. The thinking was 4 on the Constitution of the United States, beginning in the fall, beginning on September 17th in honor of Constitution Day, and 3 more lectures after that, each consecutive month, toward in and around the same time of the month. In other words, somewhere between the 15th of the month and the end of the month. I agreed, and those 4 lectures have been scheduled. I was asked to submit a schedule as well as titles for what I envisioned would be the 4 lectures. And it seemed to me that the titles for the 4 lectures, or the subjects of the 4 lectures, seemed to be pretty much a given. It would seem to me that you would have to at least devote the first lecture to the origins of the Constitution in the first place. In other words, what led to the Constitutional Convention? What led to the need of some to, on the pretense of revising the Articles of Confederation, to impose and implement a totally new government on the newly independent United States? So the background to the Constitution seemed to me to be a logical opening lecture. The second one would seem to be the Constitutional Convention itself. Who was there? Who was not there? What was accomplished at the convention? What were the things on which most of the delegates were able to agree? And what were some of the issues that presented stumbling blocks to agreement? Understandably, a major one being the institution of slavery. So it seems to me that what happened at the Constitutional Convention and how did it happen was a logical subject for the second lecture in October. The third one seemed logically to follow on the others, which would be getting the Constitution ratified. How do you get states to ratify a government whose makeup suggests that this government that you would be approving would be receiving power at your expense? In other words, you would be surrendering power to the new government by ratifying it. How do you get that accomplished? Who's opposed to it? Why are they opposed? What strategies do they employ to prevent the Constitution from being ratified? And how do the supporters of the Constitution ultimately overcome those obstacles or those strategies? And then the fourth lecture in December, would seem logically to deal with the government under the Constitution once it's created. In other words, the first years of the nation's history under the new Constitution. Specifically, the administrations of George Washington, John Adams, Jefferson, Madison. And what features of the Constitution seem to be working and what portions of the Constitution seem to need repair? Because there's no question, one of the major changes early on in the nation's history under the Constitution was the emergence of what becomes a two-party system in America. There's nothing in the Constitution of the United States envisioning parties. In fact, there's a long tradition during this period of opposition and fear of parties as being divisive. There's one more piece to that fourth lecture, and that is that the creation of the parties themselves. And that has a particularly local flavor here in southern West Virginia, because I'm broadcasting from Beckley, West Virginia, which is named after its founder, Alfred Beckley. And Alfred Beckley's father was the first Secretary of the United States Congress under the Constitution. And he was instrumental in helping Madison in Congress organize the opposition to the Federalist Party, to the party headed by Alexander Hamilton, organized by Madison, which becomes ultimately the Jeffersonian Republican Party when they're able to elect Jefferson in 1800. So the role played by John Beckley, seems to me critical, and it's going to be of critical interest to some of the people who will plan to attend this particular this particular series. Whether the series would go on beyond that into the Marshall Court and leading up to the Civil War and some attention to the war itself is still up in the air. But I've been working on that first lecture. And it's scheduled, as I mentioned, for the 17th of September. So I still have a couple of weeks, 3 weeks. But the fact of the matter is, I'm getting to the point, and this particular weekend, I actually began to put to paper some of the ideas that I think will shape that first presentation on September 17th. I'd like to share some of my thoughts on that particular subject with you. And I think I'd like to address, spend a good portion of maybe all of our second hour in today's program on that particular issue. But first of all, I think I would be remiss if I launched directly into that and didn't at least offer a few general comments about some of the things that have been happening in the nation and the world. Because there are an awful lot of things going on which are, to say the least, disturbing. I think the tanking of the stock market at the end of last week is an example of that. People's 401ks are being decimated when the market goes down 500 points a day. It plays havoc with a lot of people's plans for retirement. I dread to see mine. It's not that big anyway. And I think, getting hit with a substantial loss would be unnerving for me, as well as it will be for a number of other people. I think we'll all remember that the recession in 07-08 wiped out a number of people's 401ks, because more and more older folks' retirement is directly based on the performance of the market. And that's, as much as anything else, what is making Donald Trump's behavior of late disturbing to many. The fact, I won't get into the idea of lying. The fact is, it's generally considered to be a matter of fact, not criticism, that the president frequently lies. So many people are convinced that he really can't help himself from lying. And there are a number of issues related to that. There are also the president's America First priorities, and what that means in terms of meetings like the G7, of the leaders of the world's largest economies, the world's largest, most developed nations. And the president's behavior during his time in office of effectively isolating the United States from its traditional allies and retooling the role of the United States from the leader of the nations of what we now call the G7, a leadership which the United States developed at the end of World War II and has maintained until now. The United States and President Trump's America First policy seems to have pushed the United States into a role that some are beginning to define as isolationist. We pulled out of the Paris Climate Accords. we pulled out of the International Trade Organization in the Pacific, designed to counter the growing power of China. The president withdrew from that. The president made it a point, seemingly to sabotage the nation's relations with Mexico, with Canada, with the European Union, and then in this past week, with Denmark. Because the president made a unilateral decision, seemingly unilateral, that we ought to approach Denmark about buying Greenland. And the Prime Minister of Denmark reacted in what should have been predictable ways by A, not taking the president's desire to buy Greenland seriously, and secondly, pointing out that Greenland wasn't for sale. And a number of people have made the point that the president's behavior in all of this is equivalent to a knock coming at your front door, and when you open it, a stranger stands there and says, I was just driving by or walking by, and I decided I'd like to buy your house. And you would, in shock, would say, well, I appreciate, I thank you for that, but this house isn't for sale. And then the person at your door becomes hostile and said, you'll be sorry for that, which is exactly what President Trump responded to the reaction of the Danish Prime Minister, who called the proposal to buy Newfoundland as absurd. And the president immediately retaliated and claimed that she was being nasty. And then he began to criticize Denmark. And the fact of the matter is, if you look back on at the behavior of Denmark in recent years, Denmark was one of the nations that came to support us after 9/11 and contributed for Denmark a significant number of troops to the war effort that came directly out of 9/11, which began with the attack on Iraq in 2003 and then moved into Afghanistan, which has become America's longest war. And the fact of the matter is that Denmark actually suffered significant casualties in coming to our defense. The point being, to attack Denmark is absurd. I noticed that there is a column, an op-ed piece, in today's I believe it's in the New York Times, by Senator Tom Cotton of Arkansas, that supports the president's idea of buying Newfoundland, And Cotton makes the comment that he originally had proposed that some months ago, and that the purchase of Denmark would have significant security and material benefits to the United States. What bothers me about all of this is that this appears to be a form of international relations that was being practiced in the era of colonization, when nations bought and sold other nations, irrespective of the people in them. The president's offer to buy Newfoundland, extended to Denmark, seems to harken back to an approach to international relations that doesn't exist anymore. The era of colonialism has been reputed by the world. So one must wonder about that. And then there's the trade war with China, the tariff war with China. And the president's effort while in France for the G7 to maintain the facade that all the leaders at the G7 supported the president's stand against China, when the reality is that none of them did. The nation that we would expect would come closest to supporting us is Great Britain under its new Prime Minister, Boris Johnson. But even he spoke out about tariffs and identified himself and the nation he heads as a supporter of free trade. Despite this, the president continues to insist that the two-day conference at the G7 went swimmingly. The leaders of the nations got along fine. There were no substantial differences as there had been in the past. Everything was functioning as most of us would hope it would function. And then the president proceeded to launch into yet another attack on the media by pointing out that in his view, the media was not accurately reporting the positive nature of the G7, but was actually trying to foment differences between the leaders of nations when in fact there were no significant differences between them. And the president's position that every one of the leaders of G7 supported our policies against China, when in fact there's all sorts of evidence that that didn't take place. I would urge those of you listening who have time to check the interview with Larry Kudlow from the G7 on yesterday on CNN. And it went on for 15 minutes. And actually, Kudlow was really put on the spot for the full 15 minutes in trying to defend President Trump's position against the evidence. They were playing videos with quotes of leaders of the G7 saying one thing, followed by President Trump's comment saying exactly the opposite. And when Larry Kudlow tried to suggest that the media was taking these comments out of context, the CNN host pointed out, whom I hadn't seen, it was a substitute host, really took him to task and saying, these are quotes, videos. You just heard him say that. And then Larry Kudlow says, well, even if they are quotes, you can take quotes out of context. And then he proceeded to create context, which was an effort to make the president appear to be in tune with, rather than at odds with, the other leaders of the G7. And so it went. No divisions, no issues, no problems, until we heard that President Trump did not attend the session on climate scheduled by the G7, scheduled by President Macron of France. First reports were that he boycotted that particular session. In response to that, the White House has claimed that he had the conflict of two meetings at the same time, and he chose to go to the other one rather than that one. And then there was the sit-down news conference with President Abe of Japan, in which the president announced a trade agreement between the United States and Japan, which would be the biggest such agreement ever made between these two nations. And at that point, Abe interjected and said, there's still a lot to be worked out on that particular deal. So in effect, the president said the deal had been reached, and one of the two partners in the deal said, no, not yet, it hasn't. And then the president made the comment, which is getting a lot of attention. He seriously suggested that what the United States needed to do to combat hurricanes in this hurricane season is to set off a nuclear bomb in the eye of the hurricane and disrupt its energy. And he made this as a serious proposal. And as his advisors were wont to do, the president was told that this might be a good idea, that his staff would look into it. And then we wonder why the stock market is fluctuating like crazy. Because the president followed, and this is the last thing I would say on this particular topic. The president opened the G7 by committing to even higher tariffs against China, to which China responded by raising tariffs significantly on the United States. And in response to a question at the G7, whether in fact he was having second thoughts on the tariff situation with China, President Trump said yes, he was. And then he made the comment that he pretty often has second thoughts about everything he does and says. And the media immediately took this as a signal that the president might be softening his stand against China, because more and more the world seemed to be spiraling toward a recession, a worldwide recession, even though the president continued to deny it by pointing out the strength of the American economy. And then today, on the last day of the G7, the president announced that his negotiators had received two calls from China wanting to resume negotiations. And the president's conclusion is that a deal is sure to come out of this. Implication: we drew a line, they drew one, we drew a second, an even bigger line, and they blinked. The president, you'll recall, his White House immediately responded to the president's admission that he was having second thoughts on the trade war with China by suggesting that the president was being interpreted incorrectly, that what his second thoughts were is that he should have raised tariffs against China even higher. And that suddenly, with the predictions that this week's markets would open, the predictions were the market was down 300 points before it even opened. And then the president responded today that China had called twice, requesting that negotiations be reopened. And of course, the clear implication is they blinked, we won. And as of the time that I came on the air, China had disavowed the 2 phone calls and said we never did that. The implication being that President Trump is not telling the truth on this. The markets, because of what the president announced today on the 2 phone calls, the market this morning was up 300 points in response to that. If it is definitively established that there were no such phone calls from China, and that indeed negotiations are not scheduled to resume, then we would expect that the markets will tank. And here we are. If this doesn't make you tired, because we try cognitively to deal with these things rationally and logically and realistically. And in fact, what we're dealing with logically oftentimes seems to have no overriding logic at all. Conversations about the president's mental state are on high again. These things were speculated months ago, quieted down for a while. Now they're back. It was announced this weekend that a Republican right-wing congressman from Illinois named Joe Walsh was going to challenge President Trump for the nomination, for the Republican nomination in 2020. He's been on many of the media shows, talk shows. He said that he will be going to New Hampshire later this week, and then to Iowa, and then to South Carolina. And he made a statement, I heard him make it this morning in response to a question, that I thought was incredible. Because in 2016, he not only voted for President Trump, but he was instrumental in getting President Trump elected. And when asked about that this morning, his response was that he had never been so wrong about anything in his life. He was mortified and sorry for helping to give the nation President Trump. And his determination to run against him for the nomination constitutes his effort to undo what he labels the biggest mistake of his life. And some of the things that he's saying about the president and the president's behavior are things that I've alluded to in the last 10 or 15 minutes. I mean, basically, he's questioning whether, in fact, the president is becoming more than unhinged but is actually demonstrating that he is totally unfit for the office. This speaks to what could become the first phase of one of the most negative political campaigns in the nation's history. I'm thinking of some of the naked politics that occurred early in the nation's history. The attacks on Andrew Jackson, for example. The attacks between John Adams and Jefferson for the presidency in 1800. The fact that when Jefferson won the election of 1800, John Adams left Washington in the middle of the night because he didn't even want to be there to see Thomas Jefferson inaugurated as president. This one coming up in 2020 promises to make these historical examples of negative campaigns seemingly insignificant. This one promises to be that it'll be something to behold. Whether in fact the nation and its political system can survive it is yet to be seen. Wow. I came back into town less than a week ago, and all of this has happened since I returned and since I began to pay attention. It is unbelievable. I think I would be remiss as well. We have 5 or 6 minutes left in this, our first hour. I think I would be remiss as well if I didn't mention something else that occurred this weekend that is getting national attention. It deals with the announced retirement of Andrew Luck from the National Football League as quarterback of the Baltimore Colts. The reaction, national reaction, has been incredible. Many people were upset because at the preseason game in Indianapolis, after Andrew Luck made his announcement, he was booed on the sidelines. Obviously, he didn't play. He was booed. And this, very honestly, bothers me and has bothered a number of other people. I've thought a lot about this because, very honestly, as I think everybody realizes, I've been long been and continue to be a New England Patriots fan. Like everybody else, I feel blessed to have been able to witness the tenure of Tom Brady and Bill Belichick in New England and what it has done over the years and how they've done it. Tom Brady goes into this season at 42 years old. Andrew Luck would have gone into the season as 30 years old. He's 29 now. He'll be 30 in September. I believed, along with many other people, that Andrew Luck was the next Tom Brady. And I look forward to it because he seemed to be not only one of the most talented quarterbacks in years, but one of the most intelligent. I've heard players who played with him say this. that there were times when Andrew Luck would break the huddle and bring the team to the line of scrimmage with 5 plays in his head at the same time, making the final decision once he saw what the opposition team was doing defensive-wise. The only other person that I've ever experienced personally that did that and does it consistently is Tom Brady. And I felt that the combination of physical talent as well as intellectual ability was sure to make Andrew Luck the heir apparent to Brady. And now it appears not going to get to see that. The reason I wanted to mention this on today's program is because I think we all need to think about this. Because the negative reaction to Brady's announcement of retirement is coming from fans who feel somehow that they have rights, that they have a stake in this whole thing. And that, in a sense, Andrew Luck is backing out of a deal, is walking away from a deal that he had with the fans. And the fact of the matter is, I've had to deal with the reality that this man has made this decision and took a long time to make it. It's clearly an emotional decision. It's clearly not something he wanted to do. It's something that he felt he had to do. Where would you put the fault? On his team, on the Colts, for not putting the players around him that gave him more protection? Consequently, he's been seriously injured the last 2 years. Missed one entire season with surgery to his shoulder. Now is experiencing a bothersome problem with one of his legs, which they can't seem to fix or repair. So maybe you can blame the team. Maybe you can blame the owner of the team. Maybe you can blame Andrew Luck for taking the money and running. Because the fact of the matter is, in 6 years, he's pulled in over $100 million. But the fact of the matter is, and I heard this morning from the owner of the Baltimore Colts, of the team, who basically announced that the team would continue to pay Oliver Luck the money it owed him. And unlike, as has happened so often in the past, with a sudden announcement of retirement, that the team demands the money owed to the particular player to not be paid. In this case, Jim Irsay has agreed that Luck will get all the money that's due him, which is several $1 million. And points out, in defense of Andrew Luck, that in making this decision, which was obviously a painful one for him, Andrew Luck conceivably left $500 million on the table. Because if he had played till he was 39, 40, 41, as a lot of people expected, making on average $30 million a year, Andrew Luck conceivably would have taken $500 million in salary over the next 10 or 11 years from the Colts. And he walked away from that. which in the mind of Irsay speaks to how serious and how difficult this decision must have been for the team, but especially for him. I guess my concern, and the reason I mention this at all, is because I think all of us have lost something, including Andrew Luck. And when you think about that, what he's lost, what we've lost, what the city of Indianapolis has lost, what football has lost, you can begin to appreciate how serious the decision is, how emotional it was for him to do this, how difficult it was for him to do this. I think we're all losing something. But the one thing that I can say I've come around to believing is that I haven't lost one bit of respect for Andrew Luck, the man himself.
Hey, Bill.
Yes, Bob.
Actually, I had this in the stack for this evening myself.
Oh, great.
And you bringing it up just made me want to maybe engage in a little dialogue about it.
Go right ahead.
One of the things that I think needs to be borne in mind with regard to his situation is the science of what football does to young men's brains and bodies.
Right.
His immediate predecessor at the Indianapolis Colts was, of course, Peyton Manning, who played to a point where if he had gotten hit just right, he would have died.
Right.
Playing with a steel cage wrapped around his spine in his neck.
Exactly.
More and more, I think, and we're talking about, from midget league on up, people are saying, I don't want my kid playing this game.
Mm-hmm.
And the NFL responds by saying, well, we're going to come up with a better helmet.
Right.
Or we're going to have different penalties now.
Yeah, we're going to protect the quarterback and all of that.
That's not what puts butts in seats for the bread and circuses that is the NFL.
No.
They want to see people hit
hard.
I know that if you think back to the glory days of NFL films and those wonderful voiceovers by John Facenda. On a crisp autumn morning, the gladiators donned their armor. Mm-hmm. Oh, it really is. But we found out now. We like to think, well, they're like Roman gladiators, but nobody gets killed. Well, people do get killed. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that, I respect Andrew Luck for this decision.
I do too.
And without, at $100 million, I think he's going to be okay for the rest of his life.
Yeah, I do. Plus the fact that he's bright enough that he's going to,
and that's the next thing. And it's something to contemplate across the board, not just for multimillionaire athletes. But what is our relationship to our work? Was he,
this is good, Bob.
Obviously, the fans in Indianapolis saw him as just a football player, a great football player, but that was how they defined him. He had no exterior existence beyond that. Mm-hmm. But this is a young man, a young white privileged man who came from a wealthy upbringing. Ollie Luck, Mountaineer, played for the Oilers and all. And his father and mother raised him to have an interior life. Mm-hmm. And so he's got his thing is architecture. And apparently he paid attention. He paid attention in class at Stanford. Mm-hmm. So he's not going to be one of those lost souls who, when he retires, is going to, just feel dewless and wind up doing soup commercials for whatever he can get, or shoe ads. He's going to go out and pursue something that makes him existentially happy. And the thing is, that's the last thing in the world the NFL wants. Is someone who is multifaceted, multidimensional.
Right.
Because he can walk away and be perfectly happy.
Right.
And in our lives, our mundane little lives, we should be thinking in the same terms.
Yes, and I kind of guessed by your comment earlier that this is where you were going. I mean, we need to rethink what we do on a day-to-day basis. And I've said a number of times, Bob, and I mean it, that at this point in my life, I never would have dreamed that I'd be doing a program like this, that I'd be reading and writing and creating as much as I am. And it's absolutely renewed me.
Yeah. And we need, I think it was Nikki Haley. And I love how these privileged Republicans say things. Well, maybe kids don't need to go to college. Mm. And that's like saying, well, maybe kids don't really, this is a world that doesn't need Socrates.
Yeah.
This is a world that doesn't need Michelangelo. You need to go and learn how to be an accountant and just be an accountant. Or what really drives me batty is the STEM mania.
Right.
Science, technology, engineering, and mathematics.
Right.
Kids who go into engineering colleges, maybe they have to take English 101 and 102, and they're done with English after that.
Right.
Maybe they take a history survey class. They're done with history after that. Mm-hmm. When, in fact, the entirety of the liberal arts is why there is engineering in the first place.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
And so when we come out with another way of putting it, we need human beings who happen to enjoy being bricklayers.
Right.
We don't need bricklayers who struggle to remember that they're human beings.
Right. That's a great way of putting it. Bob, I don't know whether you happened to see it last night, but on 60 Minutes, one of the segments they did was on a football player that used to play for a defensive player for the Atlanta Falcons named Tim Green, who has ALS. And they've directly related this to the number of hits and concussions he's had as a football player in the 10 years he played. And it was one of the most moving segments I've ever seen on television, and it relates exactly to what you're talking about. Because he was interviewed in 1996 at the beginning of his career, and acknowledged that the position he played and the way he played, the tenacity with which he played, had meant that he had already taken serious hits, and he'd already had a number of concussions. And his admission was, I know I've had more than they know I had. And that was in 1996. And they asked him if this was causing him to pause about going on in football. And he said in 96, not at all. I so love this game, and I get such a charge out of hearing the fans scream for me and for the team that I'm on, is that sugar high that I get from that is worth, if it means the last 20 years of my life, so be it. And they raised that last evening.
And, that's what the NFL wants.
Right. And then last night they showed him now and pointed out how much he's physically deteriorated in the last year and a half. He can barely speak, Bob. And he was on with his son. And he pointed out that it was difficult to understand them, but he basically said that the first sign he had that something was really wrong was when he tried to clip his fingernails with a nail clipper and couldn't do it. And he began to realize that there was something seriously wrong with him then. And the one thing he said, my body is falling apart. I realized that. But he said, I still have my mind. And a couple of years ago, he started to write novels. He's written 38 novels. And he's just finished the 39th. And he can't, his hands don't work on a computer board or typewriter anymore. So consequently, they've outfitted him with a mechanism in glasses where it gives him the ability to stare at a key on a keyboard, and that keyboard strikes as if he was typing. In other words, he's typing just by looking at the keyboard and the letters making up the words, and that's the way he had to finish this novel. And then the reporter for 60 Minutes asked him, "Do you regret what you've done?" And he said, barely audibly, "Not for 1 minute, because I've got everything anybody could ever want. A family, support, I've traveled, I have my mind, I'm able to write books, at least up to this point. And I would have had none of it if it hadn't been for football. So no, I don't regret it one bit." And, and that was on last night. And then to hear you come on and talk about this with with Andrew Luck is incredible, because I think it speaks exactly to what you're saying. And you have to give him credit for making this decision. My God, he had millions in his grasp, and he gave it away because, as he said, this is not the way I want to live my life. I'm rehabbing and rehabbing again and rehabbing again. I'm not going anywhere. I'm not moving. I'm not doing anything I want to do. I'm not enjoying my life. It's time to change it. And he did it. I think it's fabulous. I agree with you.
And the greatest service he can have performed is if we can extend this into the rest of American life. I think about, I have a not good relationship with the coal industry in West Virginia, but that's not a matter of despising the people who did the work.
Right.
And timber in West Virginia.
Right.
And we're talking about industries that destroy people's bodies.
Right.
And we need to take a harder look at what we demand of people, especially relative to heavy industry in the coal in the coal mining business, black lung. And we established this, and of course my generation has already been screwed on this, but we established this idea that you can retire on Social Security at 62 or 65. The money's a lot better at 65 than it is at 62. I think my generation has to wait till 67.
Yeah.
But realistically, wouldn't we put a lot more people into the job market if we let people, while they still had their health and their vigor, what if they were able to retire at 55 and then go and do volunteer work or study architecture, go back, learn something, be a poet, be a sculptor, be a second career. You spent a life doing one thing. Well, you got a few more years of life, go and try something else.
Right.
I think we're better human beings when we do that, but you never hear that conversation take place anywhere.
No. It's interesting because in following the events in Europe during the G7 this weekend, Bob, I've picked up on not only the attention being given to the president, to Trump, but the difficulty that many Europeans have expressed with the fact in this country that we never stop working, that we seem to have no life except for what we do. And there's an article I read on this weekend. I can't even remember where I read it. But basically, the gist of the article was that we never stop, we never stop working. We've abandoned the idea of weekends. We work way beyond 40 hours. We continue to send emails and make business decisions. Many people, how many times do you hear people say that they've in the last 15 years they've never taken a vacation? Europeans can't understand this because they still relish life.
Yeah.
And see employment as an opportunity to contribute to life, not to take the place of it.
Right.
And that's what we've become. We've,
drones.
It's unbelievable. You're right. Wow. Bob, you're going to have a good program tonight, buddy.
Well, thanks. But the opportunity to just flesh this out a little bit more with you was by far more engaging to me.
Well, thank you, Bob. I appreciate you coming on because what you've added to this. I was a little bit uncomfortable, to be honest with you, with taking 10 minutes, what I thought would be 10 minutes on Andrew Luck's decision.
As with so many things, there's almost always an extension beyond the immediate.
Beyond the immediate, right? And that's really what I think you bring to this network is the ability to do this, and the ability to recognize that there is significance beyond the obvious in most of what we do and what happens. And the challenge is to see that and to appreciate it and learn from it. And I think that's really what we're about.
Andrew Luck is he is a classically liberal arts educated human being, and he's going to have the opportunity now, without having had his body completely ruined, to experience as much of the fullness of human life as one person with all that ability and opportunity can.
Right.
What Rudyard Kipling referred to as filling a minute with 60 seconds run.
That's great.
And Wordsworth talking about we lay waste our lives, we lay waste our days, spending our lives in getting and spending.
Mm-hmm.
And so he's got the opportunity, and what's more, he has the opportunity to pass it to a next generation. And if he's really committed to trying to show other people that there is a better way.
Right.
And then finally, what's probably got the NFL and the owners really having kittens with crocheted tails is that if more and more marquee players are going to do this, that means they're going to have to get their money up front, which means that contract values are going to go through the roof.
And they already are. Yeah.
Yeah. But we only think that. We haven't seen it, because the next Andrew Luck who comes along is going to say, "Hey, I may have an 8-year career and then I'm out.
Yeah.
So you're gonna have to pay me $75 million a year."
Mm-hmm.
And you know what the NFL will have to do?
Pay it. Dude, they'll have to pay it. I think what you've done is put meat around the bones of a very emotional issue. I think a lot of people can relate to this issue because so many people like football and recognize skill and talent. And this guy had it all. And for him to walk away leaves everybody in a state of stunned disbelief. And the fact of the matter is there's a lot more to it than that. And you've made that point, Bob. And
thanks for letting me kibitz, Bill.
Oh, that's great, Bob. Thank you. Hey, listen, should we just keep going and not break?
If you want to, go right ahead.
All right. Well, let me do that because
Okay.
I've
I
actually been able
I didn't mean to steal your break, Bill.
No, it's not that at all. I've been able to sit down for the 15 minutes we've been chatting, and I love it. I mean, it's great, Bob, and I appreciate it so much. I love when Agnes does the program, and she every once in a while she'll come on and offer something. It's always worth hearing, always. But the what comes out of the interactions is so valuable, I think, and this one was no exception. If anything, this is a classic example of it, and I appreciate it and thank you.
Well, thanks, Bill.
Okay, Bob.
And hey, it's great to have you back.
Okay, thank you. It's good. It's good to be back, and I think you've made it. You've made it good to be back on my first day, and I appreciate that. I want to get into, because we do have about 40 minutes left in our time together today, and we have tomorrow. So, and I appreciate that and realize that. I wanted to get to the point that I made earlier about this presentation that I've been working on the Constitution. And I wanted to share some of it with you because I think, and Bob's 15 minutes with us this hour, beginning of this hour, has confirmed this in what he's added to the conversation about Andrew Luck. There's always more to what's going on than meets the eye. And let me give you an example of what I mean. Before I left for 3 weeks, before I took the most of the month of August off doing a live program for what were personal reasons, granted. We had been talking about nationalism. And you can remember that I was reading, this would have been 5 weeks ago, about an article written by a historian at Harvard named Jill Lepore on what she called a new Americanism, the need for a new Americanism. And we had begun to look at her considerations of nationalism. And what she had been talking about is the importance of the nation's history and the people who write that history in creating a sense of community, a sense of nationalism. But in the 20th century, because of the extremes of nationalism, the word itself became anathema to most people. Because when we mention nationalism, we think of Germany in the 1930s, Italy in the 1920s. We think of Stalin. We think of racial bigotry and hatred. We think of examples of genocide. We think of efforts to eliminate the Jewish population in the Holocaust. And Jill Lepore points out that understandably, historians who spend their lives writing the history of this nation as well as other nations want to get as far away from the idea of nationalism as possible because of its evil, negative connotations. And now we have a president who, during the campaign, made it clear that he was a nationalist and proud of it. And he encouraged people to use the word and owned up to it. And we have seen very negative examples in the last weeks and months of the extremism of this sense of nationalism as it's played out right here in our own country. And we've debated, and the media has continued to debate, the degree to which the president himself is feeding these extremes of nationalism by some of the negative things he has said about Mexicans, about brown people, about Muslims. And it has become very clear over the last few weeks when the president took on the 4 congresswomen and told them to go back where they came from because they didn't belong here. I even heard somebody at the end of last week make the comment about the G7 when President Trump left this country to go to the G7, that the most appropriate thing that could happen over there was if the other members of the G7, the G6, told President Trump, because of what the performance he put on at last year's conference, to go back where he came from. So we're seeing the negatives of nationalism right playing out before our eyes. Yet the fact of the matter is, as I look at the founding of the nation, at the whole issue of independence itself, one of the things that has been always very clear to me is that nationalists played a significant role in this nation's history. It was nationalists who were responsible for securing what became the Constitution of the United States. It was a contest between states' rights and national power. And so the word nationalist is something that I think all of us have to understand in a number of different connotations and ways. And that's the issue that I chose to address in this first lecture that I'm scheduled to give on the Constitution. The idea of nationalist in this country, in the emergence of this country, and what the difference was. And in order to appreciate that difference, it seems to me, we have to understand and be aware of the difference between what we call a nation state and what one historian, David Armitage, has referred to as a state nation. That particular phraseology, nation state versus state nation, it seems to me is a critical key to understanding this whole issue. Because Armitage points out that historically, a nation is a group of people who have much more in common than they have differences between them. One author cited by Gilles Lepore is a French scholar, 19th century French scholar, named Ernest Renan, R-E-N-A-N, who wrote an article around the question, what is a nation? Renan says, the essence of a nation is that all of its individuals have many things in common, and also that everyone has forgotten many things. what must citizens forget before a nation becomes a nation? And then one example of that is ethnic differences between them. For a nation to become a nation state is for a people to construct a political framework, a constitution, a government, if you will, in order to give political meaning to the reality of the commonality that this group of people enjoys. In other words, a nation logically moves to the next stage, which is the creation of the state to honor and legitimize the existence of the nation itself. The United States is different because in our situation, we created the state before we had a nation. And in fact, the story of the nation's history, of this nation's history, is the story of fashioning the political state into the psychological nation that would rationalize and justify it. In effect, a key part of this nation's early history is to look at the efforts of the founders and those who immediately succeeded them to create a nation. Because all the founders acknowledged that there were too many things in this nation that divided its people to expect there ever to be a nation similar to other nations. For example, Noah Webster, who authored his famous dictionary, did so with the idea of coming up with a uniquely American version of the English language in order to distance ourselves from what he believed was our British past by fashioning a unique version of the English language itself, which was totally ours. It didn't work. What did work for a while was the nature of this republic itself, was the principle that we come to call republicanism. The nature of the government that we create and the values and ideals which make it possible. And increasingly, perceptive leaders began to realize that what makes this nation different from others is that the ingredients of this nation do not rely on things like common religion or common race or common ethnicity or a common culture, a cultural legacy or background to fashion a nation. What makes this nation unique is the fact that the values and ideals which led to the very creation of this nation with the Declaration of Independence become the ingredients of building nationalism to rationalize and support the existence of the political structure that the founders created. For the first portion of this nation's history, up until the 10 or 20 years prior to the Civil War, this seemed to be the essence of American nationalism. Frederick Douglass referred to this nation as a composite nation because these were ideals and values that one's race, one's religion, one's ethnicity, whether one was rich or poor, none of that need affect the commitment to the ideals and values that make this nation a nation. Therefore, we could become a nation that welcomes different peoples from all over the world to come to this one and join us by becoming a supporter of the values and institutions which gave this nation its very existence. Unfortunately, this commitment to what some people refer to as civic nationalism was derailed, principally around the issue of race. The Confederacy was based on a definition of Americanism that was driven principally by race. Americans were by definition white. Non-whites had no place, could not become Americans in the way the South defined its approach to nationalism. There's no question that the Civil War itself was in one sense fought with the idea of resolving the differences between the Southern Confederate definition of nationalism and the definition of nationalism supported by Lincoln and Douglas and others. After the Civil War ended, the so-called liberal Republicans who controlled Congress, history refers to them as radical Republicans, sought to fill in the gaps and bring to fruition the realities of the definition of nationalism, of what constituted an American, that was championed by Lincoln, by Frederick Douglass, and by some of the founders, the so-called nationalists, which helped create the Constitution of the United States. The passing of the so-called civil rights amendments, Civil War amendments, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments to the Constitution, were the nation's efforts to solidify and institutionalize the realities of an approach to nationalism which was totally different than anywhere else in the world. The 13th Amendment, which was passed during the war, eliminated slavery. Section 1. Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as punishment for crime, whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction, to the jurisdiction of the United States. So slavery is abolished. In 1866, the 14th Amendment is drawn up and eventually ratified in July of 1868. The first section of the 14th Amendment says the following: all persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and of the state wherein they reside. No state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States, nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. That Section 1 of the 14th Amendment defines American nationalism in a way which conforms to that of the founders, and basically says that any person born here or anyone who comes here and takes up residence here and lives under the jurisdiction of the United States becomes a citizen, irrespective of religion, race, national origin, gender. Well, gender comes later, as we know. In other words, the idea is that the citizenship which will characterize this nation, the nationalism which will explain and characterize this nation, is a nationalism which is inclusive, not exclusive. It doesn't exclude anybody. It includes everybody. Later on, it leads to the equality of women, which is very consistent with this. And then in 1869, ratified in February of 1870, is the 15th Amendment. The 15th Amendment guarantees the rights of all citizens in the United States to vote. The right to vote shall not be denied citizens or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. The 14th and 15th Amendment together become the epitome of a definition of nationalism that is unique in the world. Not only that, but when the United States reaches the point where it's able to become a leader in the world of nations, the potential of this definition of nationalism to begin to characterize other peoples would seem to be part of what many people believe the mission of this nation in the world ought to be. But as we know, the radical Republicans, the federal government, soon tired of the violence that engulfed the South because of the issues of race. The emergence of the Klan and other hate groups, and the violence that ensued. Many Northerners saw economic advantage in rebuilding the South after the Civil War. The South was ripe for investment. It created all sorts of development possibilities. But so long as social situations in the South continued to be violent and unpredictable based on the issues of race, none of this economic potential could be realized. And gradually, American leaders began to look for an alternative method for bringing the violence of the South in the South together to an end. And so people began to look for ways to resolve these differences. And in the late 1870s, as a result of the disputed election of 1876, Northern Republicans met secretly with Southern leaders in order to find common ground for ending the violence in the South and opening up to the South, to the investment potential which always existed there. And it became very clear from what the Southern leaders demanded in order to throw the election to Rutherford B. Hayes, the Republican, is for the federal government to pull the last of its troops out of the South and let Southerners control their own social relationships. In the South, this gave rise to segregation. In the North, it required, in effect, the abandonment of the commitment to nationalism that the 14th and 15th Amendments had demanded. What Northerners did was abandon their commitment to equality, to the ideals and values of republicanism as the definition of nationalism in this country, by a willingness to compromise around a definition of nationalism that became exclusive rather than inclusive, that permitted first the South and then eventually the North to begin to treat people of color as unequal, as not worthy of citizenship, of not worthy of being Americans. In effect, this compromise, the so-called Compromise of 1877, effectively negated the 14th and 15th Amendment on the issue of nationalism. It's in this context, it seems to me, that the Constitution of the United States needs to be appreciated. I don't think it is. I don't think it has been appreciated nearly enough. What it involves is an understanding of republicanism and recognize that in the person of historian Jill Lepore, the new Americanism that she talks about is the nationalism that Frederick Douglass and Abraham Lincoln talked about, that many of the framers saw in the nation's future. A definition of nationalism, of citizenship, that included everybody rather than exclude anybody. One of the things that really bothers me is that we have not obviously ever settled the issue of race in this country. We almost did, but never really carried it out to its completion. Jill Lepore's message to historians especially is that it's the telling of the history's history, the narrative, which explains where this nation came from and where it has the potential to go, that historians must begin to tell again, because they stopped. Because it's the history of this nation that really constitutes the building of nationalism that legitimizes the existence of the state nation that we are. I really believe that this is incredible. I believe it's an untold story. And so the story that I would like to tell is the story of the nationalists who were most responsible for bringing about the Constitution of the United States that we have. And so my theme in this first presentation on September 17th is not going to be so much this whole story of two different kinds of nationalism. Rather, it's going to focus on the nationalists that are responsible for bringing the Constitution into being, and the efforts that they made to be successful. You will not believe the story. It is incredible. Because it was very clear that in order to get the Constitution ratified, the supporters of the Constitution, who were principally nationalists in favor of a strong national government, were forced to make concessions on slavery in order to bring about the creation of the state itself. Because Southern leaders, principally leaders from South Carolina, Georgia, threatened to walk out of the convention if the Constitution did not establish guarantees to protect the institution of slavery. It has caused a number of people, commentators, right into today, to criticize the founders because of their seeming unwillingness to take a stand against slavery. And these particular criticisms tend to take issue with individuals who were willing to make compromises on principle for the political goals they saw as essential. The fact of the matter is, these people realized that you cannot have a nation, let alone a nation state, unless everybody together comes under that particular political umbrella. In a sense, then, they opposed the Articles of Confederation, which guaranteed state sovereignty and a weak central government, because they knew that the nation they envisioned could never become a reality until you had a strong central government that included everybody. And the efforts and lengths to which these nationalists went in order to create the United States is incredible. It's a hell of a story. And it's a story which I'm afraid I'm going to have to postpone till tomorrow, because we only have a couple of minutes left in our program today. Let me conclude by just making a few comments about things that I've already said here in the last half hour or so. I believe that this issue of nationalism and its inclusive as opposed to exclusive nature is one of the most important issues that this nation faces. I think the best way to make this clear is to let Jill Lepore speak to it in her conclusion to this incredible essay. This is what she says. The history of the United States at the present time does not seek to answer any significant questions. Carl Degler told his audience some 3 decades ago at the American Historical Convention. If American historians don't start asking and answering those sorts of questions, other people will, Degler warned. They'll echo Calhoun and Douglas and Father Coughlin. They'll lament American carnage. They'll call immigrants animals and other states shithole countries. They'll adopt the slogan America First. They'll say they can make America great again. They'll call themselves nationalists. Their history will be a fiction. They will say that they alone love this country. They will be wrong. That's, it seems to me, in a nutshell, what this idea, this story is all about. If we don't define this nation the way we want to define it, if the people who understand, believe in, and have faith in the potential of this nation aren't willing to define it the way it needs to be defined in order to fulfill that potential, then what we are leaving is an opportunity for people who don't know or who don't care to define nationalism and citizenship for us. That's, in effect, what we've allowed to happen. That's, in effect, what we have to reverse. I think, in the efforts of the founders to create the state and then to build the nation around it, is the solution to the issues which divide us? That's a story that I think we'll have to pick up tomorrow. For Bob and Agnes and the folks at Head On, and for myself, Bill Obrien, thank you so very much. I can't tell you what a joy it is to be back here at the Virtual Center. Thank you. Have a wonderful rest of this Monday. Thank you.